welcome to Alton's Story, where tabletop tales come to life. I'm your host, Frederick Smith, author of and narrator for The Acquired Taste for Adventure, a D&D audiobook series based upon actual Dungeons & Dragons games. And with that, let's get started. Alton's Story, The Acquired Taste for Adventure, Chapter 2, continued. After a few tense moments, artfully stealing forward on the softest sections of mud, Alton peeked around the last outcropping of rock and spotted the snarling creatures they'd heard. There were 3 of them, the largest and most vicious-looking wolves Alton had ever seen, all wearing collars attached to chains that were spiked into the floor to restrict their movement. They were surrounded by loose piles of hay and various bones strewn about the room, a nearly perfectly square space that had obviously been cut out of the solid rock with much labor. The wolves, 2 black and 1 a silvery gray, were fighting over the arm of a man, each of them growling and tugging the limb in a different direction, but none daring to let go of their prize. Alton noted that even though each one of them was almost at the end of their respective chains, there wasn't enough room for the group to get around the feral beasts without getting mauled by them. No, the little halfling shivered. This was not the path they wanted to take. He silently retreated and told the adventurers of what he had seen. Agreeing with Alton's assessment, the group opted for the other path, going to the left at the T-intersection, which would lead them away from the sounds of the wolves. However, after a short distance, this path also began to make a gradual turn to the right, and they eventually found themselves moving back toward the sounds of the growling monsters they had tried to avoid. Just as their hearts were beginning to sink, having almost come back to the same spot they'd left behind, Adriana suddenly called out with great excitement. She was saying something in Elvish over and over again to Erevan and pointing at the ground. "Adriana has found a hidden door," Erevan announced for her, explaining that the ranger had located a hole in the ground that could take them down to another level of the cave altogether. The monsters had tried to obscure the passage by hiding the opening with a slab of rock, but the unusual pick marks around it had given it away to her keen eyes. Malik's tanned arms hefted the stone aside, revealing the path down. A steep slope, slick with moisture and gravel, and with a darkness absolute. The party was concerned about the unseen dangers below, but Adriana, their illustrious tracker, assured them that they didn't need to worry. She explained, with Erevan translating, that she'd grown up in the caverns of the Underdark, navigating twisting mazes of tunnels like this one, alone, and that she felt confident she could easily lead them into the caverns as deeply as they dared to travel. Alton's suspicious eyes drifted over to meet Malik's once again, and they both nodded, acknowledging understanding of their mutual protection pact. But they had another problem to deal with first. They had almost made a full circle back to the same spot where Alton had encountered the giant wolves, and while the group of adventurers might have trouble with the upcoming descent into the darkness, the wolves clearly wouldn't. If the group's presence was discovered by the monsters, the 4-legged beasts might be released and come tearing down to attack them from behind. Even worse, the wolves could be used to block their retreat if they were forced to flee and climb back up the way they'd come. After some discussion, it seemed like the wisest thing to do was to take advantage of the wolves' chains and dispatch them while they were still restrained. But that course of action, well, it just felt wrong. The adventurers would have to draw straws to decide who would take on the responsibility, but for now they were simply trying to cope with, and reason through the guilt of, how they might eliminate the beasts in this suggested method and still call themselves decent folk. One might consider such behavior to be less than gentle. But when Malik rounded the corner and saw them, he exploded with fury. "They're wargs!" Somewhat like huge wolves, except far more intelligent and purely evil in spirit, wargs were frequently found in the same places as goblinoid beings. They were used as mounts and attack dogs when they could be captured and beaten into submission, and made for powerful, but not always loyal, servants. While they were intelligent, even capable of speech, their unnecessarily cruel and predatory behavior made them impossible to befriend. No, these were not innocent beasts on chains. They were evil killers not to be pitied. Pardon the interruption, but if you're enjoying my work, please like, subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to receive notifications whenever I upload a new video. A flood of painful memories came rushing back to Malik. He could never forgive the Worgs for what they had done to his people in their moment of greatest weakness. The dwarves had only just put out the great blaze that had destroyed a swath of Stumpton village, a conflagration that was accidentally started by his own brother, Galric, in yet another bout of drunken stupor. Losses were assessed, and while the village had managed to save what grain they could from the burning storehouses, the drastic shortage meant everyone's shares would have to be reduced. The hard-laboring dwarves, who were usually seen cutting down trees and towing lumber, were already living in community houses with so many of their private abodes gone up in flame, and they would be loath to hear such pronouncements. Less grain meant fewer loaves of bread, and even fewer cups of ale for them to quench their thirst. Many hard-working fellows had been lost trying to put out the great fire, and then all the survivors were tasked with rebuilding the northern section of the oak log wall that had burned away and exposed the town to the horrors that sometimes roamed the Hotenau mountain range. There were too few dwarves for the task already, and they were soon to be underfed and without ample ale to ease their sore muscles and troubled hearts. But the labor had to go on, and so they did, with any able-bodied dwarf joining in to complete the task. All except Galric, Malik's ne'er-do-well brother, who finally faced exile. His drunken brawling had already caused him to be the town pariah, and it was exactly this same kind of beer-soaked fight instigation that had knocked over a tavern's oil lamp, which then caught the barrels of brandy wine and eventually set the whole town ablaze. Many had called for his head, but Galric was instead branded with a mark that designated him untouchable and ordered never to return to Stumpton again. The foul wargs, cunning and cruel, watched from the safety of the hillsides as the dwarves drove away one of their most able fighters. "Let him go," they growled. The work on the town wall proceeded apace, but the dwarves, laboring without adequate food, grew weary. The wargs watched as the dwarves destroyed themselves day by day, smelling their growing weakness, the unfed exhaustion making their bodies decay from the inside out. It smelled simply delicious. "Let them work," they grumbled. The huge wolf-like monsters patiently waited, allowing the dwarves to continue working on and on, all while discussing the choicest and most defenseless members they planned to devour when the time came. After several weeks, the wargs could see that the repair of the wall was nearing completion, but there was still a burned section open wide enough for at least 2 wargs at a time to jump the temporary barrier. With the dwarves having worked themselves to a fine point of exhaustion with their insufficient sustenance, and the whole pack now having chosen their victims, tonight would be the night. Let them die. The dwarves were finishing their efforts for the day, and were sharing what meager portions of bread and drink they had as they began the walk back to their homes. The pack of 4 wargs, having belly-crawled through the tall grass until they were within 50 paces of the wall, suddenly seized their opportunity and sprang from their cover, clawing their way across the field. The wild-eyed wargs had broken themselves into 2 groups of 2, and the first pair leaped the temporary barrier, both of them clearing it and tearing off in different directions after their selected prey. The dwarves, exhausted and lethargic, slowly became aware of the threat that had descended upon them, and went clumsily scrambling for hammers, hand axes, tools, anything to defend themselves. Malik, going in and out of a daze while trying to enjoy his watery ale and moldy bread, looked up as the second group of wargs sprang for the wall. This time, one slipped while jumping and fell onto the temporary barrier, issuing a howl as it injured itself and ran away into the fading light. But the other one cleared it, turned, and ran toward Malik's position with a devil's fire burning in its eyes. Malik tried to stand up and wield a piece of wood as a club, but he was so physically drained he lost his balance, falling backward over a pile of logs as the warg rushed his group. The massive wolf clamped down on a dwarf child who'd come out to work that day, its jaws fitting the whole of both his arms, postured in self-defense, into its mouth. It then started violently shaking its head side to side, with the shrieking youngster being tossed about, as helpless as a rag doll. Another 4-legged fiend attacked a different group, grabbing a worker and crushing his head with a single bite. This created a desperate panic, with terrified dwarves scattering and screaming, pushing each other aside to flee for their homes. The warg, having tasted blood but still unsatisfied, turned to attack one of the few who was still trying to fight, an old dwarf wielding a carpenter's mallet. The warg, intelligent and calculating, could tell the brave fellow would soon tire, so the monstrous beast nipped at the dwarf and withdrew, until the combatant could no longer muster the strength to fight anymore. When it was clear he could no longer defend himself, the warg burst forward and snapped at the exhausted dwarf 3 times, its huge canine teeth impaling his chest in numerous places. The beast then moved on to another victim, leaving the old dwarf bleeding to death and wailing in agony. Malik could take no more. He drew upon reserves of energy he didn't know he had, staggering to his feet and hefted his sledgehammer. He advanced, demonstrating the stubborn bravery that he and his brother were known for. He rallied a few dwarves to fight behind him, making a stand for the village. They were exhausted, but to lose here meant certain death for all of them. The wargs, evil and calculating as always, were not interested in combat. Having already killed several of the weakest dwarves, they simply dragged off the largest bodies they could get away with before Malik and the others had a chance to attack. The predators escaped to the mountainside and chuckled while listening to the survivors wail on through the night about their pathetic old strays and sad dead pups. Let them howl, they thought, as they licked their bloody chops. A moment, my friend. Erevan, the high elf noble, placed his hand on the dwarf's shoulder and snapped him back to reality. Malik suddenly found himself back in the cave, with both his hands on his great axe, preparing to strike at one of the wargs. We can, at very least, end their lives peacefully, Erevan offered a weak smile. The monsters were now straining at their chains, snarling at the group while uttering despicable curses at them in the growling warg and chittering goblin tongues. Erevan gesticulated a series of hypnotic hand movements, shaping the planes of creation to his will, and cast a spell of sleeping upon the wargs. The group moved forward and dispatched the monsters one by one, telling themselves they were preventing many future massacres by killing the evil beasts. It was only this rationale that allowed them to perform the unsavory deed. And that is where we are going to leave it for today, but rest assured we will pick up from where our story left off in next week's episode. Thank you so much for staying all the way till the end of the video, and if you enjoyed my work, please consider donating to my Patreon, which you can find linked in the description. I appreciate all of you, and until next time, please be kind to yourselves and to each other.